Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Greatest Games podcast brought to you by The Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. Opposite me is Jonathan Wilson. And with us today is Daniel Edwards, an Argentina-based football journalist and contributor to Goal, Bleacher Report, and the English language Argentine football podcast, Hand of Pod, among others. Daniel, pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, Marcus. Hi, John. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Lovely. All the way from Argentina.
All the way.
Well, today we're going back to the 1967 Intercontinental Cup, played between the winners of the Copa Libertadores that year, Racing Club, and the then European champions, of course, that year, Celtic. Daniel, I mean, this is quite the game, or set of games, should I say? But over to you. Why have you chosen this match?
I think it's a very interesting match. Obviously, living in Argentina, I specialise in South America and Argentine football, and I'm British. So this was really the first official game, let's say, between a British side and an Argentine side. Prior to this, there were many kind of South American tours that various English teams did, and also Argentine clubs that come over to Europe and play British sides. But kind of moving into modern football, when you already have established the European Cup, the Copa Libertadores, of course, the World Cup. It just seems kind of a landmark game because I think as well, kind of following on as it did so soon after the 1966 World Cup, Argentina, England, and of course Ralph Ramsey's notorious animals insult to the Argentine teams. This game and the ones that followed it, the Estudiantes Manchester United game that followed the following year, I think they really did help to kind of colour British fans' opinions of Argentine football teams, their fans, and kind of create a narrative which in some respects has persisted even to today, certainly through kind of the 1980s, 1990s, subsequent Intercontinental Cup games, World Cup games, and meetings between the two countries. So kind of what I set out to do, kind of when I started studying this match, because quite a few years ago now, I wrote about it for John for the Blizzard. What I looked to do was really kind of look into the game, not just take the easy stereotypes, the Battle of Montevideo, flying fists, dirty Argentines, and Celtic being robbed of this trophy, this legendary Celtic team under Jock Stein. Kind of look at the games and see, is that actually the case, or is there a little bit more to this story?
Sure. Well, and we'll get on to that, Daniel, because there's an awful lot to talk about here. There's a little bit of admin to get out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, so I'll do that now. So this game, as I say, the winners of the Copa Libertadores and the European Cup, it was a two-legged affair, but the tie wouldn't be settled on aggregate or indeed away goals. They used a points system, perhaps created by an Australian, who knows, with 2 points being awarded for a win, 1 point for a draw, and no points for a loss. So a team could win 1-0 in the home leg and then lose 9-0 in the second leg. But that would mean both teams were tied on points, and thus a one-legged playoff match would be required to be played in a neutral country. So quite an intriguing approach to proceedings, Jonathan. And this was perhaps a match that British football fans were sort of quite unaware of, Celtic being the first British side and off the top of my head, perhaps the first non-sort of Latin or Southern European side to win the European Cup. So they went into the first leg at home to play this side, Racing Club from Argentina. Quite an exotic affair, I would imagine. And in those days, you didn't know quite what to expect. But as Daniel said, there was those Alf Ramsey comments during the 1966 World Cup that perhaps skewed people's opinions on Argentinian footballers. But the game itself was quite explosive. I mean, you've written as well in Angels with Dirty Faces, your book on the history of Argentinian football, about this tie. Immediate thoughts when this game leaps to mind?
Well, I mean, Dan's right. It's a lot more nuanced than than just kind of dirty arges, which I think is the kind of the easy way of looking at it. And I think the
Mm.
context of '66 is important. That there's very little sort of distinction made between England, Scotland, Britain in South America as a whole, and this was sort of seen as being against the same enemy. Um, but it's also, I don't think these games really were out of the ordinary for certainly international fixtures involving South American clubs. If you talk to people who played in the early Libertadores games, they were all horrifically violent. They were all battles. Um, and Racing would travel around with a squad of 40 boxers to protect them, who they pretended were photographers. So, and you talk to people who played for them, or people who played for Boca when they played the games against Santos, and they talked about how you go to the away game and you just knew the 3 or 4 days you were there, you were under siege, and you needed the protection. So, as with all the sort of the most combustible European against South American clashes over the whole course of football history, and they started playing each other 115 years ago. The first tours went over,
Mm.
and it's just cultures that don't understand each other. Suddenly finding points of friction and that exploding into something far greater than ever needs to be. But Racing were conditioned that when you went abroad, as soon as you step on a plane, you're going into the unknown, and the unknown's probably pretty dangerous and pretty unpleasant.
Mm. Daniel, how did Racing find it then when they went to Glasgow for the first leg? They would lose 1-0. Billy McNeill scored the goal. I mean, there was a lot of interest in the game. A lot of revenue generated as well. There was huge interest, certainly from a Celtic point of view. I'm sure from a Racing point of view as well. How did they find it when they arrived in Glasgow, and how they were greeted by the press and the locals?
Yeah, absolutely. There was huge interest in the game. In fact, prior to the final, Celtic changed the venue. They didn't play at Parkhead. They changed it to Hampden Park because they needed the extra capacity, and
Hmm.
Hampden Park was full to the brim of Celtic fans. Of course, I think if I remember rightly, Racing had taken very few fans along with them, possibly only 100. But the sense I get is Racing were very very pleased with the reception they received in Scotland. They had a lot of respect for the Celtic team. That comes through in all of the testimonies I've written. They were aware that Celtic were a very strong club, a very good team that kind of suffered no falls. So there was definitely the sense that they were in for a very difficult match, and it wasn't going to be easy by any means. And yeah, that first match, you can see that Racing, who were known in Argentina for playing very fluid attacking football, um, possibly taking into account that kind of reputation that Celtic had as well for all-out attack, just really taking games by the throat. They sat back. They tried to probably just take the draw because, as we were talking about just now with this format, if you grabbed the draw away, then you had a massive advantage going into your home game because all you needed was any kind of win, and that's it.
Well, the home leg was very important back in the home leg was very important back in those days, as you say. I mean, some of the reports suggest that Racing, they very much set up to defend and take the draw, and this is where, Daniel, that perhaps your findings from a British point of view are quite interesting and important because, again, you mentioned right at the start of this, it's tempting to take the easy way out of this, and I'd love your sort of opinions, or perhaps the opinions of Racing, because one can immediately say here that Racing turned up, they defended in numbers at any cost, they time wasted, they were committing cynical fouls all the time, breaking up the play. The Celtic players kept going on. You watch the former Celtic players at the time in a little documentary you find on YouTube and so on. They moan about the spitting and the kicking and the headbutting. They said that they'd never experienced anything like this before. And so the temptation is to just think, well, poor old Celtic, turned up and just tried to play a game of football. And this side from Argentina turned up to try and spoil the game of football at every given opportunity. Is that how Racing see it as well?
No, of course. I think you're always going to have the case where in almost any game, the winners are gracious and think, oh, yeah, we won probably because we were the better team on balance. And the team that loses will tend to look at specific moments where they feel hard done by, right? That's human nature. But Racing, no, that Racing team, a product of the 1960s in Argentine football, which was, as John mentioned, an extremely uncompromising era with kind of violent play tolerated to an extent where it obviously wouldn't be now and probably wasn't so much in Europe. But from what I've seen, the Racing players themselves, they recognise that they were a long way from home, very little time to prepare, and they went out to spoil. Juan Carlos Rulli, who was one of the real hard men in the Racing team. He admitted, I saw a documentary on Fox. He just came out and said, almost laughing, the Scots, they were tough guys, and I'm not going to lie to you, we wanted to slow them down. So,
well, he commits one foul on Jimmy Johnson, which is absolutely horrific.
Yes.
I mean, Jimmy Johnson, who's kind of a classic sort of little jinking Scottish winger, and really he's not tall, actually, is he? I met him kind of randomly. It wasn't random. I was talking to Umberto Maschio, who played on the left of midfield in this game, and he came in to see Maschio at the end of this marathon, sort of 4-hour interview. Maschio just wouldn't let me leave. He just kind of had more anecdotes to tell me. And Rulli came in, and we got another hour out of Rulli as well. But that foul on Johnson is just like,
it's ridiculous.
Okay, that's just a red. Like now,
in any era of football,
well,
that's a horrific challenge.
Yeah. But I mean, I think generally that first game wasn't too controversial. I mean, the Racing team find themselves. They fly to Rio, then fly, I think, Rio to Madrid, Madrid to London, London to Glasgow, and on the London to Glasgow leg, who's on their plane but Sean Connery?
John Connery, yeah. One of the many famous Racing fans that play.
Does he still live in Argentina, Daniel? I believe he was living there for a while, wasn't he?
So he,
not to my knowledge, no.
So because he's a Rangers fan, and was a very good footballer himself. He played for Bonnie Rig Rose famously.
He did.
He decides he'll turn up in the dressing room before kickoff to kind of try and motivate them, which is just the most extraordinary. He's at the time he's playing James Bond. He's absolutely at the peak of his fame. Turning up in the dressing room at Hampden to kind of whip up the Racing side. But I remember Chango Cardenas, who eventually scores the winner, but he was 19 at the time in this game? He was a kid. It was playing centre forward.
19, 20, yeah, very.
And he said that they were actually treated really, really well, and the only sort of hostility they felt was when the anthems were played before kickoff. The Argentinian anthem was whistled, but he said, compared to Libertadores games, this is like the red carpet and kind of, and then the game itself. There's that foul, and then there's this little sort of like backwards headbutt by Martin on Bertie Auld. But apart from that, it's a competitive game, but it's not sort of a massively aggressive game. We wouldn't be talking about it now if that was the only game that had been played. Put it that way.
Yeah, if it had ended there, I think that would have been the end of the story. I loved Rulli's definition. Is in Spanish it comes out as un partido de pata dura, which literally would be of hard feet. And that's probably as decent a definition as you can. Guys going in strong, taking no prisoners, and making themselves felt. I think I'll be absolutely astounded if in Racing's mind they weren't thinking of, at least if they couldn't win in Glasgow, at least putting down a marker. So when Celtic do get on the plane to Buenos Aires, that would be in the back of their mind, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the black eye to Billy McNeill and a few other choice injuries might have done that as well. But of course, back in those days, I suppose that wasn't so uncommon in football matches. But we'll get on to the second leg where Celtic turn up to Argentina. And Billy McNeill himself said, well, a lot of the Celtic players said that, they were fairly well welcomed by the locals, and that wasn't really, there was no real problem there as far as I understand it. But he said, the welcome when they got to the stadium, McNeill described it as nothing short of horrific. And but I mean, Manchester City found that out when they went to Anfield. So let's not be too perhaps European about this, Jonathan.
Yeah, and the goal Billy McNeill scored, Racing or certainly Mashio was furious about it. Not about the anything to do with the scoring of the goal,
The
but
goal in the first leg.
in the first leg, which Celtic win 1-0, and they worked on set plays a lot because they knew Celtic were obviously when you've got Billy McNeill and you've got John Clark, you're going to be good in the air, and Coco Basile just didn't pick him up. So Mashio was still kind of 45 years later when I spoke to him, was still raging about Basile failing to pick him up. But then what's interesting is Billy McNeill's reaction is, and he was a very sort of calm, authoritative leader, but he actually has a go at Basile as he scores. So he taunts him after scoring, which is very unlike him. So something was clearly going off, but it was far less than would happen.
Yeah, and in that second leg, which Racing won 2-1. I mean, this was when the kind of the tempo was really raced quite a lot in this fixture. Ronnie Simpson in goal for Celtic. He was struck by an object thrown by the crowd and would be replaced by the sub keeper. I think that was before even kickoff. John Fallon went in goal. There was a moment, Daniel, am I right in saying, when Tommy Gemmell, he scored a penalty for Celtic in that game. And this was despite local sort of photographers and journalists encroaching on the pitch, trying to put him off as he's taking the kick.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, when Ronnie Simpson's failed before the game, if you look at the Racing ground even now, you'll see it's a big wide bowl. You've got between the pitch and the 20-foot crash fences, you've got a moat, and then from the other side of the fence to the stands, you've probably got another 30 feet. So it's very difficult to see how someone would have thrown a coin or some sort of object from that far to do damage. The prevailing theory these days is that it was in fact one of the photographers and not a fan.
Oh, right.
That took him out.
Well, there's all kinds of controversies about this because there's some people say, oh, it must have been fired using a catapult. But again, they had like protective net up, so how do you get through the net?
Yeah.
So
mesh,
photographer seems the most likely thing. But Django Cardenas was sort of like, well, yeah, he got hit in the face by someone and he was bleeding, but it wasn't like you needed stitches. What was wrong with him? Why didn't he just play on?
In fact, Fallon says afterwards that he could have played, that Ronnie Simpson could have played, but Jock Stein insisted that Fallon goes in, and he suggestion was Jock already kind of getting his excuses in early. He kind of saw how this game was going, which I thought was interesting. And going back to Gemmell for a second, the penalty is an interesting one. It's Jimmy Johnson who just tears away after an error in the Racing backline. Agustín Cejas, the Racing goalkeeper, has really no choice but to take him down. Photographers are crowded around behind the goal. Gemmell fires it home without many problems, and then something happens which I think is fantastic. I was watching just recently kind of the grainy live broadcast of this game, and as soon as the goal goes in, the photographers actually run onto the pitch to get some action shots, and the commentator who's talking to you, he's actually behind the goal, and he comes onto the pitch to have a chat with Cejas. He says, Cejas, bad luck, mate. What are you thinking? And Cejas, really not wanting to speak much. Yeah, I decided to go to my right, but I couldn't quite make it. All right, better luck next time. And wanders off again, goes back to the commentator.
Well, I mean, it's Soccer-Aid-esque in this country, that kind of thing. My goodness. Well, okay, gentlemen, let's have a quick break because there's so much to talk about here, and we do have the the important sort of third leg, if you like, or player to chat through. So let's have a quick break. Welcome back to Greatest Games, everybody. Now, so after the end of the second leg, it was 2-2, of course, but aggregate didn't matter. So it was a draw on points, 2-2 on points. And I should also say, but by the way, just to kind of ramp it up a bit more, after the match, as far as I understand it, Daniel, Celtic dressing room was invaded by Argentinian fans. As well. So there was a bit of unsavoury scenes there, and there were some Uruguayan fans who had travelled to Buenos Aires to support Celtic as well. So there was a bit of crowd trouble, and Jock Stein said he didn't want to play the third match; he just wanted to go home. But of course, they needed to go to a neutral country, which was Uruguay, to play that to play that playoff match.
Yeah, after the second game as well, you can see it in the broadcast. There's a pitch invasion. The Racing players are mobbed by fans, and one of them is wearing kind of a very 60s open collar, open wide collar shirt. Just starts accosting Jimmy Johnston and trying to rip the shirt from his back, and Johnston just looks so pissed off. I mean, we'll probably talk about this a bit more. Talking about this third game, what I found with the second game was that it wasn't like with the first leg. It wasn't dirty per se. It was hard. It was there were a lot of big hits from both teams. Like neither of the two teams held back. But Jimmy Johnston in particular, you can see he was identified as the danger man by Racing. Kind of just a fantastic dribbler, so good on the ball. And they went out to put him off his stride. He was hit throughout the game. I think right at the start of the first half, after Racing's second goal, there is a criminal tackle from Roberto Perfumo, the legendary Argentine defender, and almost takes Johnston's leg. Almost amputates his legs. And then you had this thing after the game, and Johnston just looked so put out, so just like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. And you get the feeling after that second game that was the feeling that Celtic players had. They really didn't want a third match. I think in the end they accepted because it was going to leave a lot of money for the club, and they didn't want to let the 130, 140 so Celtic fans who had travelled to South America with them down. But yeah, Jock Stein, once he had agreed, he decided that that Celtic would give as much as they're forced to take. Were his words. They weren't going to look for trouble in Montevideo, but if there was any more violent play, they weren't going to stay in their shells.
Yeah, Jonathan, what going into this sort of playoff match? There was obviously tensions were running high and so on. There was chat that the Paraguayan referee stopped the match after 23 minutes to say to both captains, look, players will be sent off should all this foul play not stop. I mean, reading about it does seem to be an absolute, shambles.
Oh yeah, I think the choice of venue was really not a good one. I mean, obviously the Centenario is one of the great iconic stadiums, but the fact that Racing had they beaten Nacional of Uruguay in the Libertadores final. So weirdly, both teams, you talk to players from both teams, and they both say, "Oh, the crowd was against us." The Racing think the Uruguayan crowd were against them because of Uruguay-Argentinian relations, but specifically because Nacional had been beaten by this Racing side. But Celtic are obsessed by this idea that, all these South Americans all hated us. And there's this argument as well, or not an argument, this sort of disagreement, that both teams carried out Uruguayan flags to try and curry favour with the locals. And Chango Cardenas said, when Celtic took out the Uruguayan flag, they all cheered. When we took it out, they booed us anyway. But then Billy McNeill said, well, they had a bigger flag than us, so they got a bigger cheer, so that set the crowd against us even more. And so both sides clearly felt the atmosphere was generally hostile. And clearly, that the whatever the feelings of Uruguayans, there were sort of 20,000 Racing fans had gone over. There's no distance between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, so I think most estimates say around about 20,000 Racing fans there. So at least they have sort of a core support. But yeah, that first quarter of the game, there's just sort of little fights breaking out all over the place, terrible tackles, and I guess the ref knew he was losing control. So supposedly he called the two captains over, Martin and Billy McNeill, and said, "Look, if this goes off again, I'm just going to send off a player from each side." And for some reason, he picked Rulli. I can see why he picked Rulli, but he picked Bertie Auld, who is just sort of of all the people on the pitch, arguably the most placid.
Yeah, poor old Bertie.
But he's a designated scapegoat if something goes off again, and of course it did go off again.
Yeah. Well, it would continue to do so for the rest of the game, really, Daniel. I mean, when one can talk about it. It's often when Celtic talk about this, as you say, that they feel more victimised. However, some of their players do look back on this and think, "Oh, we let ourselves down." But there's still a narrative of, "Oh, we let ourselves down by going down to Racing's level." Do you think that's fair?
I would contest that. As I say, I watched
Mm.
the second leg in full, and it's a hard game, but Racing weren't particularly more guilty, I don't think, of foul play than Celtic. Their speciality were these tactical fouls, these niggling fouls, kind of stepping on insteps, clipping someone's heels, their knee into the thigh, these kind of things. Kind of very, more than violent, this kind of psychological violence, if you know what I mean, just kind of chipping away at the opponent's patience, and they provoked Celtic into losing their heads, while they kept relatively calm. You might not like it as a strategy. It's not beautiful football or anything like that, but I'd say what you see throughout the games is Racing are much more committed to keeping the ball on the floor. Their technique is fantastic across the pitch. I saw, you have guys like Coco Basile, who was as hard a centre half as they come, chipping over. I think it was Murdoch's head with a sombrero, and just carrying on running. Umberto Maschio, who was a fantastically stylish player, and just had so much ability on the ball. And I think that as well kind of chipped away at the Celtic nerves. They went kind of long periods in all of the games, especially the last two, without seeing the ball, and they were almost chasing shadows. And of course when hell does break loose in Montevideo, surprise, surprise, the guy that really gets it going was Rulli again, who for about the 10th time over the three legs chops down Jimmy Johnston. And that's when Celtic just absolutely lose it. You have John Clark running across, kind of putting up his jukes like a bare knuckle boxer.
Yeah.
You have riot police coming on the pitch, and it all just fell apart from there. Although, and Clark, funny enough, wasn't sent off. The referee Osorio, the Paraguayan, he actually sent off Bobby Lennox in a case of mistaken identity.
Yeah, I mean, Celtic weren't innocent. I mean, that you could, Jonathan, you can find clips of this game, quite grainy footage and so on, of Celtic players putting in their fair share of kicks and choice actions, if you like, and so on. I mean, reportedly, Tommy Gemmell booted one of the Racing players in the balls, which
It's not
behind the referee's
reportedly. There's
back.
footage of it. You can see it.
Yeah, well,
It's Maschio. He kicks. I mean, he says Maschio spat on him, which, I mean, who knows? But and Maschio, fantastic footballer he was. He could look after himself. I mean, he played for Italy in the Battle of Santiago in '62. He was one of the Oriundi who went over to Italy, and although he was Argentinian, he ended up playing for the Italy national team. So and I'm not saying necessarily that the allegation of spitting is true, but I can completely imagine he'd have wound people up and put in tackles. And but yeah, Gemmell gets away with it completely. He's just sort of on the blind side of the referee, and it's just sort of the great thing about it is he runs up to him, kicks him as he puts it in the ghoulies, and then this little scuttling run away to kind of to get out of the referee's eye line as he turns around to see why Maschio is collapsing on the ground. But Maschio really seems to hold no ill will against him. He just sort of seemed to find the whole thing hilarious. This is just what football is. So yeah, this incident 3 minutes before half time, you end up with Basile and Lennox being sent off. But yeah, Lennox goes off. Jock Stein tries to push him back on. The referee sends him off again. Jock Stein sends him back on. Referee sends him off again, and this time a riot policeman with a sword, like a drawn sword, make sure he doesn't go back on.
I mean, it's I mean, this is the thing. Like, it's such a hard sort of thing to get your head around because, again, I think Jonathan. I think you said earlier that when you get the European sort of footballing culture and the South American footballing culture, and when they clash like this, it is an almighty clash. Because if you look at the statistics, Celtic had 4 players sent off in that game to Racing's 2. We've just talked about Gemmell getting away with booting one of the players in the bollocks. I'm sure there were other off ball incidents, no pun intended, that players should have been sent off for, and so on and so forth. So this idea that Celtic were the victims and Racing were the aggressors might be a bit of a disservice to Racing. However, when you look at the matches in this, in subsequent intercontinental ties, I think you mentioned Manchester United and the Estudiantes at the start, Daniel, and then Estudiantes against AC Milan and so on, where one of Milan's players was knocked unconscious and so on. This type of atmosphere, this type of violence and aggression on the pitch and off it, seemed to be more prevalent in South America than in Europe, especially when European sides played each other. It wasn't.
You say that, but the Nobby Styles became this sort of great bête noire for Argentinian football. He was seen as being the sort of the face of kind of the brutal English game. You look at his foul on Jackie Simon of France in the '66 World Cup. That's as bad as anything that really does here. But and Simon broke his leg and was put out the tournament and never fully recovered. We never think about that. I just sort of think you're preconditioned to see certain things, and obviously, temperatures have been ramped up by what happened a year earlier. But then, Jimmy Johnson gets sent off 3 minutes after half time, and it is one of those things of kind of, well, okay, technically it is a red card, or it's not. Sorry, not a red card. Not no, it is a sending off, but given the beating he'd taken over 2.5 games, the fact he gets sent off because as somebody holds his shirt, he swings around and sort of flaps a hand at him. That was really, again, I think, wasn't it? Is you can see why he'd feel aggrieved. He has technically committed a sending off offence because he has sort of given Rudy a clip around the back of the head, but his shirt's been held and he's been kicked to shit for 2.5 matches.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if anyone on the Celtic team did have legitimate cause for complaint, it would be Johnston. I believe it was Oscar Martin who got elbowed. Rather than Rowley. It was, and the episode itself, as John says, it's not the worst elbow you're going to see, probably even in that match. But it was completely unprovoked. He had Martin kind of tugging on his jersey, just trying to slow him down. And this is a guy who played fantastically in the second game in Avellaneda, but by the time he got to Montevideo, with everything that happened, you just felt he wanted to be out of it, and that was quite an expedient way of getting an early buff, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So Racing would go on to win 1-0. I mean, there was incidents from before the game right up until, well, after the game as well. How was the victory treated in Argentina, Daniel? Was it seen as a great win for kind of South America, or was it a bit more local than that?
A great win for Argentina. I don't know if you could generalize to the whole of South America, but for Argentina, definitely it was something that that kind of transcended club loyalties, club rivalries. I've heard kind of testimony from Independiente fans. Independiente, of course, being Racing's great rivals. Their stadium's 3 blocks away, and they'd already had a couple of attempts at winning the Intercontinental Cup. They lost in consecutive years, 64, 65, against Elenio Herrera's famous Inter side. And what they said to me back then is that a lot of guys who were Independiente fans, they would also, they turned out to welcome Racing back on the boat from Montevideo. They cheered for them. I think the following game, Racing received a guard of honor and a standing ovation on the red side of Avellaneda, which, if you have any kind of knowledge of this rivalry today, you think, what? That just couldn't happen. That's impossible, because it's such kind of a keenly felt local and often violent rivalry. Racing were the first Argentine team to be crowned world champions, as they call themselves. That game is still very fondly remembered. Every now and then, you have a lot of retrospectives on it on Argentine television. They will Cardenas out every year on, I think it's 4th of November, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
to give his reminiscences of the game, and I think that match as well took on special importance for Racing, because what followed it was kind of 34 years without a league title, 20 odd years without a continental title, until they won the Supercopa Sudamericana in the 80s. But on a general level, I must say I was reading John's work, Inverting the Pyramids, prior to recording, and you mentioned the influence of politics, which I think is absolutely valid. The year before Racing won the Intercontinental Cup, there was a military coup in Argentina. This General Onganía took over, a very kind of sinister character who looked to quash dissent in the universities. Kind of had no qualms about kind of putting a hard line down against dissenters. But he was also a guy who placed a great deal of importance on sport and kind of the prestige it would give to Argentina abroad. So all of the teams that did manage these kind of continental international triumphs, Racing in '67, Estudiantes in '68, they were very much given a hero's welcome and presented as kind of national icons, because it was politically useful as well, right?
Yeah, and I think when you have a military government, it's not universally true, but I think that sort of legitimizes cynicism. It sort of says the ends justifies the means, and I think you see that across history. That certainly happened with Italy in the 1930s. That there's a sense that what matters is not how you win, but winning. That somehow that moral pragmatism takes over. But I think as well, the way that it was celebrated. I don't know if you feel this when you see Cardenas every year, but it's kind of. I'm not suggesting he regrets it, but he was 19 at the time, and he scored. It's a brilliant goal. He's 30 yards out, 25 yards out, smashes a shot in the top corner. It makes his club the world champions, and he's 19. And you just think maybe you can do that too early in your life. And I got this great sense of weariness off him, that he was telling the same old story. I mean, it must have been 2011, 2012 when I interviewed him. So for 45 years, he'd been asked about this one goal, and he works now. I mean, he might not now. He's 75 now. But when I interviewed him, he runs a very small real estate office in Floresta, which is a pretty ordinary barrio of Buenos Aires. And you go in, and there's this very basic office, and there's one desk, and there's a little sad pot plant, and then he's in the back office. So it's just a 2-room office, and facing his desk, there's three pictures on the wall. So there's a painting of him scoring the goal. There's a diagram from El Gráfico of the goal that's been framed. And then the saddest thing, and I did sort of get this sort of this sense of melancholy off it, was this is like a double page spread. The center pages from Tiempo magazine, which is sort of an Argentinian current affairs magazine of the 60s. And it was Tiempo's People of the Year 1967. And there was, I don't know, maybe 20 people on there. And slap in the middle is Cardenas, with Mirta Massa, who has become the first Argentinian to win a global beauty contest. So he's in his racing kit. She's in this sort of pale blue, very 60s swimsuit. And on the other side of him is this sort of burlesque comedian called Neumann, I can't think of his first name, dressed as an angel. And it's just such a weird, of its time picture. And it's very starkly shot. It's just a studio with these 20 people lined up. And you think every day he sits at his desk and he looks up and he thinks, look what I used to be. Look what I did in 1967. And nothing he's done since has come close. He only ever played 5 times for Argentina. He never won another title in his career. At 19, he'd done it all. And there was, I sort of felt there was this sort of great melancholy about him that his whole life had been slowly downhill from then.
Mind you, Jonathan, it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all, as they say.
If you're saying to me now, would you like to have scored a winning goal in the Continental Cup final at the age of 19 or not? I'd still say yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard to generalize. Obviously, El Chango is known for that moment, and he gets carted out every year, as I say, to talk about it. He carried on for a few years in Racing, but that was kind of the peak of that Racing club, that Racing team. The same year they lost the title, the national title to Estudiantes, who in this kind of weird new format, the Argentine Liga come through, finished second to them in a group stage, and then just bullied them out of the eventual final and won 3-0. The following year, I think, as well, in the Copa Libertadores, Racing went out at the semi-finals. They couldn't quite get there, and on their account, from their point of view, that's where the success just stopped. It dried up, but then you can say, for every Chango Cárdenas, you've got guys like Agustín Cejas, who was also very young at the time of the Intercontinental Cup. He was only 22, and he went on, to play for Pelé Santos. He went on to play for the Argentine national team. Had a glittering career. He's considered by many as on the podium of Argentina's greatest goalkeepers, alongside Amadeo Carrizo and Ubaldo Filiol. Basile, of course, he was quite a young lad as well at the time, and he went on to have a fine career as player and as a coach. Roberto Perfumo, he just turned 25. He was getting to his peak, and now again he's considered one of the greatest Argentine defenders of all time. So there was huge quality in that team, and an enduring quality. I think they were just a little unlucky that this fantastic side, the coach Jose Pizzuti had put together, El Equipo de Jose, kind of started breaking up. I mean, so much, I think, in that team depended on Maschio, and he was already kind of in his Indian summer, let's say. So it was a pinnacle, and the decline, as we say, it wasn't immediate. They came second in the league. I think in '68 they had a pretty decent title run as well, and in the Libertadores they came close, but when the titles dried up, there was just this decline, and by the '70s, Racing were a shadow of the team they were before.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel, it's been fascinating talking to you about this fixture from the history of football. I mean, I implore anybody to go and check out more of it, because no matter how much you spoke there, Daniel and Jonathan, in depth about it, there's still a bit more to see. There's more kicks, there's more punches, there's more spitting, there's more controversy, and so on and so forth. So do check it out. But for more stories like that, do go to theblizzard.co.uk. But Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me.
No, not at all. Jonathan and I will be back next week with another great game from the history of football. Till then, have a good one.